Hello, Modern America historians. We are going to be starting our fifth unit. This is going to probably be basically our last unit. We have 5 weeks left of school. We are going to try to maybe have a mini lesson on some things leading up to 9/11 and what happened with 9/11 and that type of stuff. We just haven't been able to cover things as fast as normal. So we're going to go heavy on Unit 5, equal rights, or the equal rights era. We'll talk a lot about civil rights and events leading up to the Civil Rights Bill and things like that. But this is pretty much it. So today we're going to start off talking about some things leading up to the Civil Rights era. When we talk about the Civil Rights era and minority groups gaining the same rights as whites, that kind of starts in the early 1950s, maybe late 1940s. We'll talk a little bit about Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in Major League Baseball in 1947. Some people might say that's kind of the very beginning of the civil rights era. There were certainly people fighting for civil rights before the 1950s, but it didn't gain a lot of traction until the 1950s. 1954, you see it up there, civil rights era, pre 1954. 1954 was Brown versus Board of Education that we'll talk a little bit about, where it starts ending segregation. But this stuff that we're going to talk about today is about the things that occurred before 1954. So first of all, what is a civil right? Well, it's something that you're born with, and it is an enforceable right or privilege. So you're born with it. You don't have to earn it. Driving a car is not a right. Okay, you have to earn it. All right. So you have to be able to go pass a test. Now, to vote, if you're born in this country, there's a right. You have a right to vote. You don't have to pass a test. You don't have to pay a fee. You should be able to go vote because you're a citizen. That's a right, right? Freedom of speech. They can't throw me in jail because of my political opinions. I could maybe get fired from a job, but I could say whatever I want, and they can't throw me in jail if I'm not hurting anybody. And so there is a limit to freedom of speech. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater or something like that. But a right is something you're born with. And so that's what we're talking about with civil rights, things that every person has. So some pre-civil rights era rights, some of the first amendments made to the Constitution. The first 10 were the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press for the first, freedom to bear arms for the second, and so on. Well, the 13th Amendment made slavery illegal, and this is occurring right after the Civil War, as the Civil War ends. The 13th Amendment is going to make slavery illegal. And then they also will ratify, the states will, the 14th Amendment, which grants citizenship to all persons born in the United States, including former slaves, and guaranteed all citizens equal protection of the laws. This is a big one today, the equal protections of the laws, and you'll see a lot of court cases and the Supreme Court will look at the 14th Amendment to make sure everybody is getting equal protection of the laws. And then finally, the 15th Amendment is passed, and that says no citizen shall be denied their rights to vote based on race, color, or previous servitude. So if you remember, right after the Civil War, the South isn't going to just want to follow these laws, these new amendments right away. So how is the North, how is the Union going to force them to do this? They send the army down there. And so the US Army is in these southern states, and they call this the Reconstruction era. Basically from 1865 to 1876. Just over 10 years is how long this era lasts. And we've learned about how it ended, with the deal made between the Republicans and the Democrats when neither presidential candidate got enough votes. So anyway, it goes for over 10 years. The Army, after the Civil War, basically enforces these new laws in the South, and African Americans get rights. many African Americans run for public office. As soon as 1876 ends, or as soon as the agreement ends, the Reconstruction era, no more African Americans are elected to positions. Voting is going to end. We talk about the Jim Crow era. Well, it's an era mostly in the southern region of the U.S. that denied rights to African Americans. It lasts from the end of Reconstruction to the Civil Rights era, till the Civil Rights Bill, actually, in 1965. And so the Jim Crow area was denying rights to African Americans in the South. So we talked a little bit about this before, but if you wanted to go vote in the South and you were African American, well, they made you either pass a test or pay a fee. Now, most poor people, white or black, couldn't afford to pay a fee to go vote. They're going to spend that money on food or something that they need. The tests were often very difficult. If a lot of people couldn't even read back in those days, black or white. And so they grandfathered white people in. They said if your grandfather had voted, you could vote. Well, all the African Americans after Reconstruction, their grandparents had been slaves, so none of them had voted. The white people, their grandparents had been white and could have voted even though they were poor. And so the white people were grandfathered in. That's where that term comes from. And the African Americans could not vote. If they did, and sometimes even if they wanted to like try to pass the test or pay a fee, they could be lynched. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. The origin of Jim Crow. Where does Jim Crow, the term, come from? It goes back to the 1820s. There was a traveling minstrel, basically a traveling actor that put on shows as part of a group, moved from town to town. And this actor, one of the things he did is he dressed up in blackface, where he'd paint his face black and he'd pretend to be an African American and he'd act kind of dumb, sing and dance and act kind of dumb. It was very racist. And the name of that character was Jim Crow. Well, he made money. People wanted to see this. And so other performers started copying this and also performed as Jim Crow. And that's where that term comes from. Every once in a while, you hear about people getting in trouble for wearing blackface. White people, they'll put makeup on, and you think, well, even though some people might not be trying to be racist when they do it, might think, well, okay, I'm dressing up as a person for Halloween or something, I'm going to put blackface on. Going back to the 1820s and 1800s, and you go back to how, what happened, how it started as being very, very racist. So it's just a very, very bad idea to do that. If you're a white person and you ever think in the future, like, hey, this isn't a bad idea. I mean, I'm going to dress up as Jackie Robinson for Halloween. Do not paint your face black just simply because going back to that era, it has this stigma on it that it's just not correct. Do not do it. Even though you might not think you're hurting anybody, it's just a recipe for disaster. Do not do it. And this is where that started. You can watch video clips. There's plenty of books out there, articles that you can go find and learn all about Jim Crow and all about kind of the racist history of blackface. So Jim Crow era is all of this separate facilities, separate schools, no rights in the South. Now, don't get me wrong, the North wasn't perfect. There was lots of racism in the North. Oftentimes, African Americans wouldn't be paid equally to whites. African Americans may not get as good a job as whites, but they did have many more rights in the North than they did in the South. So we talk about a lot of African Americans being lynched between 1882 and 1968. So about 80 plus years. Over 3,446 African Americans in the United States were lynched. Lynching means you are hanged without a trial, or you're killed without a trial by a kind of a mob. Over 1,297 whites were also lynched. But where did most of these lynchings of African Americans occur? 73% occurred in the South. We learned about it in Minnesota history. A couple of you are in that class. In 1920, in Duluth, 3 African American circus workers traveling with the circus were accused of rape and lynched, and the woman was never raped. She never even saw these people. She kind of made it up, and they didn't care. They just went down and started arresting the African American circus workers, and they ended up hanging 3 of them. So it did happen other places, but it was mostly happening in the South. So we'll talk about some of these civil rights leaders that are kind of like the George Washington of civil rights. You know, they were the Martin Luther King Jr.'s before Martin Luther King Jr. One of these guys is Booker T. Washington. He believed in industrial education. He said it's going to be a slow process. We are going to become educated. We're going to have colleges. We're going to have teachers. And over a long period of time, eventually whites will see us as equals. And he's one of, not the only person, but one of the people that helped start the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. During World War II, we talked about the Tuskegee Airmen who helped win World War II. They would have been training down there. And so Booker T. Washington was a very important civil rights leader and focused on education. There's the Tuskegee University, founded in 1881. Still there. The second big civil rights era guy of the late 1800s, early 1900s was W.E.B. Du Bois. He was Harvard educated, so very, very intelligent, right? You got to be super smart and hardworking to get into Harvard. He wants equal rights now and believes in fighting for it. So where Booker T. Washington said it's a slow, gradual process, Du Bois said, no, we want it right now is what we want. Got a link here that I'll put up later on the Niagara movement that he was involved in. So one of the things that Du Bois is helped start, one of more than just one person, there's a bunch of people that started it, but the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It's founded in 1909, is a group that is going to fight for rights of African Americans in the United States. Some other important people of the early 1900s, Jesse Owens was a star track and field athlete who won 4 gold medals at the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. We talked a little bit about this during World War II unit. He was a guy that he almost said, I don't want to go, because he said a minority group in Germany is being mistreated, the Jews. And said, but he kind of went when they were calling him, some people started calling him anti-American. Anyway, he goes there and he wins 4 gold medals, and it's kind of like America being able to say, look, an American went over there and beat Hitler. He's been talking about the master race and everything like that. Our guy just brought home 4 gold medals. He comes home. FDR does not invite him to the White House. They had a big party for all the athletes when they got back to New York at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And when all the athletes walked in the front door, they made him go in the back door and go up kind of like an elevator used to haul supplies up and down. So even though he's this big hero, he's still not being treated equally. He's also a guy that a good athlete, they don't know about this stuff, started smoking packs of cigarettes when he got into his 30s, and he dies fairly young. And that just one more thing, don't smoke, don't vape. Joe Louis, heavyweight champion of the world in 1937. We saw some of the videos on him earlier where he fights Max Schmeling in 1936. Schmeling was the German heavyweight champion, and he didn't take Max Schmeling serious, and Schmeling defeats him in 1936. Hitler, of course, is pumped up. The Germans are the best. They're the master race. 2 years later, in 1938, Joe Louis defeats Max Schmeling, knocks him out right away. Basically, he took training serious. The night before the fight, his friend says, Joe, are you scared? And Joe said, yeah, I'm scared. Scared that I'm going to kill Max Schmeling. And he basically destroys him in the first round. So kind of another win. It was important because you have the entire country. Every citizen in our country was listening into this on the radio, waiting for results. So now you have you have a group of people, whether it doesn't matter if you're white or black or whatever, you're cheering for Joe Louis. So you have white Americans cheering for a black boxer to defeat a white boxer, which was something that didn't happen early on. Now, a few events leading up to the Civil Rights era. Plessy versus Ferguson is a very important Supreme Court case. It was 1897, and a guy by the name of Homer Plessy was, this is a picture, but it doesn't really do it justice for a few reasons we'll talk about. Homer Plessy was a African American, but he was only 1/8 African American, so he was very light skinned. People didn't even know he was African American, but it was a setup between Plessy and the railroad company. The railroad company was tired of having to have double the railroad cars, one set for whites, one for blacks, and they said, let's get this changed, because there was a law in Louisiana and most of the South that you had to have separate railroad cars. That was a law. If the train company didn't provide it, they could be sued. And they said, we don't like this law. It costs us money. So Ferguson, I believe, was the owner of the railroad company, and they set it up. They hire a police officer. They hire this Homer Plessy, and he sits down, and the guy comes to take tickets and doesn't even know he's black. And Homer Plessy's like, am I allowed to sit here? And he's like, sure. And he goes, even though I'm African American? And the guy goes, oh, I guess you have to move. And then a cop was sitting right there. It was all set up. He arrests them, goes to the courts, and goes all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court says, yes, it is legal to do that and have a law that says that. That law is constitutional. So they basically say it fits into the Constitution is if you have separate facilities, but they need to be equal. Well, they weren't always equal, but this holds up from 1897 until 1954. So there's Homer Plessy. And you can see little political cartoon, separate but equal. This one says separate but not equal. The white drinking fountain, black drinking fountain. And even though they always said, yep, separate but equal, you could have a white school with all the newest, best stuff, and then an African-American school across town that didn't even have blackboards in it, and the Supreme Court would say, yep, that's equal enough. It fits. So it was separate but equal, but it really was always unequal. The Great Migration we've talked a little bit about kind of has two different periods. One in the early 1900s until about 1930, with a huge migration of African Americans north, getting jobs in the new factories created by the Industrial Revolution. Lots of immigrants also coming to the north. Remember, the South still doesn't have a ton of factories. The South is still agriculture. The North, lots of factories. And then it kind of dies off in the 1930s. Why do you think? In the 1930s, there wasn't big migration. That's right, the Great Depression. And then it picks up again during World War II and lasts until about 1970. The 1910 migration to the 1920s is going to lead to the Harlem Renaissance that we read about and learned about during the Roaring '20s. The NAACP, which we mentioned earlier, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, started in the early 1900s. Basically, they would get donations, they'd get money, they'd hire lawyers, and they would fight against injustice, and they still do to this day. Birth of a Nation. This is a little bit of history forgotten here, but these early films of the 1900s were silent films. They would have subtitles underneath, they would have music playing, but nobody talked, they just acted. Well, this was basically the greatest cinematographic, or however you want to say it, film of the silent film era. Just that the graphics were good, the storyline was kind of riveting, there was lots of action and adventure in it, and so it was better than anything people had saw. The problem was it was incredibly historically inaccurate, and it was incredibly racist. In the film, they turned the Ku Klux Klan into heroes. So it was kind of set during the Civil War. The Ku Klux Klan are kind of the heroes of the South. And basically, after this 1915 film becomes so popular, the Ku Klux Klan, which kind of died off after Reconstruction, springs back up again, and people start joining. And even in Minnesota in the 1920s, we have this huge numbers of the Ku Klux Klan popping up and people joining. And around New Prague, there really wasn't anything, but you start to get into other towns. Like, you can find articles, Minnesota history, we've been looking at it, but places like Faribault and Waseca and Owatonna and Albert Lea, they had these big like parades and thousands of people marching in it all across the state. Now, we didn't have hardly any African Americans in Minnesota, so who were they rebelling against here? They were going after the new immigrants. Germans were one of the big targets. Any African American, or sorry, any immigrants from like Eastern Europe. Our country was founded on Protestantism, right? Non-Catholic Christians. So all these Catholics are now immigrating to the United States and moving to like Minnesota, and they're moving to these towns, and all of a sudden these people, the Ku Klux Klan members, are in Minnesota, are going after Germans, they're going after Catholics, they're going after any kind of new immigrants that are different, and those are kind of the leaders. Up on the Iron Range, you had Scandinavians joining the Ku Klux Klan. You had people whose parents, grandparents, maybe great grandparents from New England had moved west to Minnesota, and these people were the leaders of the Ku Klux Klan. And it was across the state, and you kind of forget about it. By the end of the 1920s, it dies off. But Birth of a Nation springs the Ku Klux Klan back from oblivion. This big movie that everybody's kind of forgot about. This director, D.W. Griffiths, years later kind of apologizes for the movie. He directed it, and it was a big feature film, and he tried to make another movie that was against racism and against the Ku Klux Klan, but he's going to be remembered for this one. Now, when we look at like World War II is going to help get the civil rights era going. You had African Americans fighting and dying during World War II. During World War I, there was a lot of segregation. During World War II, you had whites and blacks serving together. The Double V campaign was bring democracy abroad and at home. Victory is what the V stands for. So try to get this democracy, get more rights at home. And it works to some extent. You see things start to change a little bit, but also there's a story where a guy comes home and he's a World War II hero, and he tries to vote, and they don't want him to, and he does, and the next day he's hanged and lynched in the South, and there's a sign next to him that says this guy voted. Didn't say guy. So World War II does start to make racism a little bit unpopular in the United States because of Hitler and the Holocaust and everything, and people in America are like, yeah, we're way better than that. But it doesn't change things real fast. We also see European colonies in Africa start to gain their independence. You look at the map here, you can kind of see it's going to start following maybe 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 years after. A lot of them kind of a decade after World War II. Algeria, Mali, Niger, Chad, they're all going in 1960. Sudan in 1956. Libya in 1951, and so forth. Some take a little bit longer. Angola in 1975. There were some wars in these places, civil wars and stuff too afterwards. The Cold War is really going to help put an end to racism and really push things along, because the Soviet Union's over across the ocean and saying, okay, in communism, everybody's equal. Look at the United States, talking about capitalism and democracy, and look how they're treating minority groups in their country. And so there has to be changes made saying, if we promote democracy, we got to practice what we preach. So the Cold War that we just learned about is going to help with that. And lastly, one of the big groups is, we talk about Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier. There were professional baseball teams that African Americans started, and they had their own league, the Negro Leagues, that sometimes were very popular. They'd have big crowds of thousands of people, and that's basically they're going to end after Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier. They'll kind of slowly start to fade away, which was a good thing, because now the best African American players are going to the major leagues, and I will have a little link to that as well. See some of the. There is the down in Kansas City, Missouri. There is the Negro League Hall of Fame, which I'd like to go to someday. So we will talk more about the actual civil rights era here in a couple days.